saw that Job at the beginning was a very faithful man, described as perfect and upright. Also a very wealthy man, one of the greatest of the sons of the East, and that he had 10 children, and that the picture is presented of a very faithful family. But there was an adversary, or an enemy even, who stood up in one ecclesial gathering and when challenged said, well, Job is really only in it for what he can get out of it. Doth Job fear God for naught? And that issue was so important. It's hard to really comprehend that, but it's still an issue very much with us today, as it's been with every generation. It was certainly with the disciples. So this question of why we serve God, why people serve God and their sincerity is very important. It goes to the heart of the righteousness of God. And so God chose to remove all of Job's worldly possessions, all of his employees, all of his children, and his health in order to answer that accusation from the adversary. And that was answered by the end of chapter 2, that Job indeed served God because he loved the truth. And he loved the fact that God was righteous and he wanted to be like God. So the friends came along and they felt that there was a situation also that needed to be addressed. And they really said, doth Job suffer for naught? They believed in exact retribution, and they believed that Job was suffering exactly as he deserved because he had done something. But they were never able to really define what Job had done, and Job really answered them with one observation. He said that the wicked don't always suffer and the righteous don't always do well. And they had no answer to that question. They just kept pushing Job harder and harder for a confession, which never came. And so in the end, Job was left contending for his own righteousness because they were saying he was very unrighteous. And in doing so, he was led down a path where he made some unfortunate and incorrect statements because they said, God is punishing you. And he said, God is not punishing me for unrighteousness because there is no unrighteousness. So in the end, where is God? And Job said, I can't find him. I can't hear him and I can't see him, and almost got to the extent of saying, well, God doesn't really care what goes on in the world because the wicked do prosper. Very often the wicked prosper and are never punished for their wickedness, even dying well and being revered in death. And so that was the end of the discussion. And a young man, Elihu, came forward very politely but full of exuberance. He said, I'm like a wine skin ready to burst. So he was a very enthusiastic and colourful young man, but he was a man that changed the course of the argument. And I believe that he had a great deal of care and affection for Job, who was probably one of his fathers in the truth. And he introduced a new aspect that none of them had ever covered. First of all, he said, well, because Job had said, I need a mediator. I need someone between me and God so that I can have this out with him. If I could just put my case before God, all would be well. And Elihu said, all right, here I am. I'm a man like you are. Yes, Job, you understand that it would be impossible for you to stand in the very presence of God and put your argument. You would be overwhelmed by his greatness, as any of us would. But I am here in answer to that request. I'm like you are. I'm made from the clay. I'm a man the same as you are. So that was the starting point. And then he said, God does communicate with people very often and in very many different ways. You are quite wrong in saying that God doesn't communicate with people. In fact, what Elihu did, that was one of the things that he did was different, was he never said that Job had committed any great sin. All he did was recall the words that Job had said during the discussion and said, you were quite wrong in what you said, in some of the things you said about God. So one of them was that God never spoke. And he said God speaks in many ways, in dreams, in visions, through his word of truth, and even, yes, in suffering. And he painted a picture of Job, this poor man sitting there I envisage him in a rubbish dump. Someone says it actually say it's a rubbish dump. Well, no, I don't think it does, but it's got dust, it's got ashes, it's got flies, it's got broken pottery, it's got a man that smells. It sounds pretty close to a rubbish dump to me. But you can call it was outdoors because people were walking past and mocking him and laughing at him. So it was something like that. And so I've lost my train of thought completely. Elihu painted a picture of Job, and he said that God communicates sometimes by suffering, even great suffering. And the great suffering the picture that he painted of Job, he then said the purpose of it can be to draw man back from the pit, from the grave. And he said what God ultimately wants to do is to be able to attribute to man his righteousness, God's righteousness. So he's turning the discussion away from Job's righteousness to God's righteousness. And that was where the discussion needed to go. And that's what all of us need to realize in our lives. We have no righteousness of our own. Only God is righteous. So that's where we left Elihu at the end of chapter 34. And we'll move on to chapter 35, and we'll be moving very quickly because there's a lot to get through. So at the start of chapter 35, verse 2, he said that Job had said that my righteousness is more than God's. And he also said in verse 3 that Job had said, what profit have I if I be cleansed from my sin? Now, that wasn't exactly what Job had said about himself. If you come back to chapter 21, just to pick up the comment that Elihu is talking about, and it's not inaccurate, but it's not exactly perhaps as he said. In chapter 21 and verse 7, Job had said this. And as I said, the friends had no answer to this. Wherefore do the wicked live, become old, yea, and are mighty in power? Because that's what happens. So if the theory of exact retribution is true, that shouldn't happen, but it does happen. So therefore, this exact retribution, you sin, you suffer the next day for that sin, is wrong. And then he goes on to talk about the wicked. And in verse 15, he says, this is what the wicked say. What is the Almighty that we should serve him? And what profit should we have if we pray unto him? And that's what the wicked say. That's what people in the world say sometimes. You're religious. What's the point? You pray to God. You're praying to the air. There's nothing to be gained by it. So whilst that wasn't Job's thought himself, what he is saying is that's what happens, and they get away with it. So maybe that is the situation. What is the profit in serving the Almighty? And that's what Elihu picks up on in chapter 35 when he says, well, you've said, what profit have I if I be cleansed from my sin? What advantage is there in serving God? Back in chapter 35. Well, the first point he makes is an interesting one, and it's not quite the whole story. That's an interesting thing in Job, by the way, is that we need to be careful sometimes about quoting from Job. Sometimes there's a lot of truisms in Job spoken by the friends and, of course, by Job himself and Elihu. But the context is not always true. The friends were coming from a position of wrong doctrine, but they were saying a lot of things that are right. And that is the way of wrong doctrine sometimes, is that it's close to what is the truth. But when it's actually identified for what it is, you find it's actually a long way away. And they were miles away from the truth, but it seemed very close. So you've got to be a bit careful when you are quoting from Job. It's the inspired record of a conversation, but it wasn't an inspired conversation. Anyway, so what Elihu says now is true, because what he says to Job is in verse 6, okay, you say, what profit will I have, do I have if I follow God? And he first of all answers by saying, well, what profit does God have if you follow him? And he says in verse 5, look under the heavens and see, and behold the clouds which are higher than thou. So perspective is important when we think about God. And he says, if you sin, what do you do against God? Now, we know that there is rejoicing in heaven over one sinner that repents, and that God takes great pleasure when we make choices in our lives that honour him and that try to put into practice his character. He loves that. He loves to see it. But viewed from afar and addressing the complaint that Elihu is addressing, it's true. What can we do to harm or to help God? As an individual, we're just little specks crawling around on a rock, as it's sometimes described, in this huge universe. We are getting above our station if we start to think of ourselves on the same level as God, or as Job had almost come to do, as he was putting his righteousness up as comparable with God and saying, I haven't done anything wrong and I'm prepared to go to court and argue that point if I was given the opportunity. So Elihu really is addressing that balance by, I suppose, going to another extreme in verse 6. If thou sinnest, what doest thou against God? Verse 7, if thou be righteous, what givest thou him? Or what receivest he of thine hand? As I said, you've got to balance that statement with other parts of Scripture. But it is true that it's like God said, the cattle on 1,000 hills are mine. So what do you think it really means if you bring an offer a bullock? Do you think I need the meat? It's silly, isn't it? So God does want us to understand his position. It's important in refining the way that we serve him. And that really is what Elihu is saying here. So let's put things into perspective first of all, Job. Don't go comparing ourselves with God. He's already said God is much greater than us, and we need not bother about whether we think that God is righteous or not in a particular situation. He dealt with that in chapter 34 when he said God is always righteous. So don't worry about that. For all of us, don't worry about whether God is being righteous or not. It's not possible for him to be unrighteous. And if we think that what is happening is unfair, then it's because we don't fully understand. And that's the position that Job was in. So that's the first thing he says. And then as far as the matter of prayer is concerned, he says in verse 10, verse 9, by reason of the multitude of oppressions, they make the oppressed to cry. They cry out by reason of the arm of the mighty. So he says many people cry when they're in distress. Some people are converted on their deathbed because suddenly they are faced with the prospect of certain death. Many people turn to God briefly when they are suffering and then turn away very quickly once the suffering's gone and forget all about it. But, says Elihu, none or very few say, where is God my maker who giveth songs in the night? There's not so many people who are inspired to turn to God when everything's going well, because they think that everything's going well because they caused that. And that's something for all of us to think about. We tend to pray more readily when we've got problems, but hopefully, and I'm sure we do, all pray to God when things are going well and thank him for that, and pray that we can use whatever the benefit is in his service. So Elihu points that out, that the subject of prayer that you raised in that comment about the wicked is a very shaky one. In fact, he says, verse 13, surely God will not hear vanity, neither will the Almighty regard vanity. So people who just pour forth empty words to God when it suits them, or because they're in trouble, the Almighty really doesn't respond to those prayers because they're not really prayers. They're just giving vent to the emotions of the person at the time. So he uses that point to answer Job, and then he gives Job a little warning himself at the end of that chapter. Now, I'm using the NIV here. As I said, it's not good to shop around for translations to say what you wanted to say, but nonetheless, Job is a very ancient book and not easy to translate in certain parts, apparently, so it's good to look at different translations. And I think verse 14 to 15 sums up this part of Elihu's discussion. He's talked about the prayers of vanity, empty prayers that really don't mean anything. And he said, do you expect God to respond to every one of those prayers? Well, he doesn't. It's as simple as that. And he knows the difference perfectly. So he says to Job, how much less then will he listen when you say that his anger never punishes and he does not take the least notice of wickedness? That's what you've said, Job. And Job had said that. God will not respond to those sorts of accusations. God's on a different level to us. So whilst it's wonderful, I think one of the great things about Job is it's wonderful to pour our hearts out to God. And Job spoke very honestly to God and at times foolishly. God responded to what he knew was really the heart of Job, and that was a faithful man who wanted to serve God. But God will not necessarily respond to foolish things that we might say to him. But nonetheless, it's wonderful to see a faithful man who poured out his heart in the way that Job did and who was very, very honest in the things that he said to God. Sometimes right, sometimes wrong. And God told him that. But God also used him in a wonderful way and improved Job, as people say. It wasn't so much to prove Job. Chapter 1, verse 1 tells us what God thought of Job, but he was certainly improved by the process. So Elihu, there's a little word of warning here. Don't go too far down this path, Job, because God will not respond to those sorts of accusations or the position that you've taken. Okay, so we move on to chapter 36, which is the fourth speech of Elihu. And here, he defines clearly what his position is. By the way, as I think I said yesterday, Job was probably a bit disappointed that Elihu wasn't, what he really wanted was a go-between to defend him in the presence of God. It's not quite going as he had thought, because what Elihu is doing is defending God in the presence of Job. Nonetheless, this is what Elihu says in verse 3 of chapter 36, I will fetch my knowledge from afar, and I will ascribe righteousness to my Maker. So Elihu makes it quite clear that he is presenting the righteousness of God. And that therein is going to be the answer to this great dilemma. And it is a dilemma because, of course, as we keep saying, Elihu doesn't know the reasons behind Job's suffering. Neither does Job. Neither does anyone except God, the adversary, and us. But he does make some important statements in chapter 36, which we'll go through very quickly. He is presenting God's righteousness. He is taking God's side in this discussion, Job, which was not what Job had really hoped for. Verse 7, he said, God withdraws not his eyes from the righteous. So the contention or even the feeling that we might have that God's no longer caring for us, that's not true. It's simply not true. It might feel like it's true, and it's a common human feeling that we all experience, but it's not true. God does not withdraw his eyes from the righteous. Furthermore, in verse 10, sometimes he opens their ear to discipline and he commands that they return from iniquity. So God deals with us in different ways. But in the end, in verse 15, he delivers the poor by his affliction, is a better translation. And he openeth their ears by oppression. Job. Sometimes that's the way that God works. Now, of course, for Job, he hadn't done any great sin, but nonetheless, he was a human being like all of us, and he needed to understand that the way that God used suffering. And down in verse 18, he comes back again to this point. Job, be careful about the path that you're going down. If we are going down a path that is leading us away from God because of our suffering, then we need to think very carefully. And in verse 18, that's how the RSV translates verse 18, which is, I think, a good translation. He said to Job, beware lest wrath entice you into scoffing, and let not the greatness of the ransom turn you aside. Now, isn't that interesting? He used the word ransom before when he was talking about the fact that God speaks to us through suffering sometimes, and he painted that graphic picture of Job himself. And he said that sometimes suffering is the ransom that is paid in order for God's righteousness to be attributed to a man or a woman. And that was very true and very prophetic. I'm not sure that Elihu understood how deep that was. And this is almost prophetic here. He doesn't know that Job is suffering primarily for somebody else, for an adversary who needed correcting. But he just says, let not the greatness of the ransom that you are paying. And it was very obvious to everyone that Job was paying some sort of price for something. If you lose all of that and your health, you realise, as he realised, this is actually from God. This does not look like random chance. It could have been. It could have been, because all suffering doesn't necessarily have to have a reason, but it always has a purpose, as we talked about the other day. But in this case, it was from God. But don't let the ransom that you are being asked to pay turn you aside from God. Don't think that God has deserted you and that you are on your own. So that was the other point that Elihu is making. And I'm sure he is helping Job. We know he is helping Job to look at things from a different perspective, because Job is not debating him. He's not disagreeing with him. He understands what he's saying. Now, as Elihu is speaking, there is a change takes place in verse 26 of chapter 36. Behold, God is great, and we know him not, neither can the number of his years be searched out, for he maketh small the drops of water, that they pour down rain according to the vapour thereof. A storm is brewing. Verse 29, also can any understand the spreading of the clouds or the noise of his tabernacle? And I don't think there's any doubt that there was a great storm brewing as they sat there discussing this issue. Because what was happening was the atmosphere was being prepared for the voice of Yahweh to thunder forth. And so I imagine that dark clouds had gathered, that lightning was flashing. Elihu was becoming scared. It said in verse 1 of chapter 37, at this also my heart trembled and is moved out of his place. And it caused Elihu to come to the end of his discussion, but to make one final point to Job about the goodness and severity of God. Job needed to understand that. He says it in verse 31 about the rain and storms in general. For by them, in verse 31 of chapter 36, Elihu said, God judges the people. That's the severity of God. You up in Sydney here have just had floods. We get very little severity down in Melbourne, where it's a balmy, warm climate for most of the year. But I know up here you have tremendous storms to judge you. That's what Elihu says, the severity of God. But he also, in the same verse, gives meat in abundance. The goodness of God comes from the same source, in the same way, just regulated differently. And Job, you need to understand this. And this is beginning, brethren and sisters and young people, to give us an understanding of what the answer of God is going to be. Look over in verse 13 of chapter 37. He talks about the weather and the extremes of weather. And it's not just weather, it's earthquakes. It's all the things that shape this planet. And we are all, after all, just little bits of dirt that was taken from this planet and formed into a man, and we're the offspring of that. So what shapes the planet shapes us. And he says in verse 13 of chapter 37, God causes it to come, whether for correction or for his land or for mercy. So this great storm that's brewing above them, and the storms in our lives, or the storms on the earth, God uses them for correction sometimes, for his land, to benefit the land itself, to benefit us as people, and for mercy. Now, a great storm had come upon Job in his life, a horrible storm. But Elihu is trying to make him think of that differently, or to think of things differently, to think about God differently, that he uses all different ways to shape his planet and the people on that planet. So he says in verse 14, one of the wonderful verses out of the book of Job, "Hearken unto this, O Job." And by the way, Elihu's the only one that calls him by his name. And I think that's also an indication that Elihu loved him and had a close relationship with Job. Not that the others weren't friends, they were. "Hearken unto this, O Job, stand still and consider the wondrous works of God." How difficult that can be for all of us to do sometimes, just to stand back and think about God in the midst of all the troubles that we face. And over in the final verses of the final speech of Elihu, he said, "He, Shaddai, is far beyond our reach, supreme in power, in righteousness, excelling in justice, yet no oppressor. No wonder that men fear him, and thoughtful men hold him in awe." Beautiful final words from a man, I think, who did a wonderful job for his good friend and probably father in the truth, Job, to help to turn his thinking around and to prepare him for the words of God. And now God is going to take over at the start of chapter 38. And this, of course, is the greatest section of the book, and something that hopefully we're going to enjoy together over the next study and a half. So now in chapter 38 and verse 1, this great storm has been brewing, culminating in a whirlwind, a howling wind, and Yahweh answers out of the whirlwind. And really, the record is taken up from chapter 1. The whirlwind had destroyed his children. And after that, they all searched around for the answer to why these things had happened to Job. And finally, here in chapter 38, the whirlwind comes back, and now it has the voice of Yahweh. What a moment that must have been for Job. And he was going to discover just who God is. And he was going to discover, as we all need to remind ourselves, that we are just finite beings, but God is infinite. And it was folly of Job to challenge him. Now, at this point, Job understands more of the reason for suffering, or the purpose of suffering, because Elihu has outlined that to him. But he still doesn't know why he's suffering. Why is it right that he has lost everything when he didn't do anything wrong? Or nothing particularly wrong. How could that be right? And viewed from one angle, we would say, well, it doesn't seem right. Yes, we understand about suffering and the reason that God is using that to direct all of us closer to him. But there's still something that is unanswered, and God is going to answer that for Job. Now, the words that God uses in answer are obviously divine. They are from God, direct. It's probably spoken by an angel bearing the name Yahweh, or perhaps the voice came from the clouds. I don't know. But it's the voice of Yahweh. They are not what we would expect. They are not what Job would have expected, perhaps even not what he wanted. But in the end, they were what he needed, and that's what makes it such a wonderful section of Scripture. There are no tender words of sympathy here, and there's nothing wrong with tender words of sympathy. We all need those from time to time, but God doesn't use any of those really, not obviously anyway, in these chapters when he answers the problems of Job. There is no criticism of Job's friends, and that would have been disappointing for Job. Again, now God's going to speak at last. These three friends are going to get their comeuppance, but they didn't, not yet anyway. There is no vindication of Job specifically. God doesn't start off and say, Job, I know you didn't do anything wrong. And Job would have loved that. And we would think, well, maybe that would have been a nice place to start, but it wasn't where God started. And God didn't reveal the whole story yet. And maybe he never did. I sort of think maybe he never told Job what had happened and that Job will find out in the kingdom. And I'll talk about that a little bit in tomorrow's study, God willing. Nonetheless, God answered out of a whirlwind, a continuation of from chapter 1 and verse 18. And he's going to answer as to whether the earth is really as Job had suggested, because Job had sort of suggested that God wasn't really controlling things, that he'd taken his eye off the wicked and the righteous and the way they suffer or don't suffer, and that things were just happening without God's involvement or even care. I don't want to put wrong words into Job's mouth or I'll be like one of his friends, and we want to learn from their mistakes. But he'd sort of suggested that. So the first thing God says is, well, first of all, he says in verse 2, who is this that darkeneth counsel by words without fire? And who was he talking about in that verse? I think there's no doubt he was talking about Job, because in chapter 42, as we shall see, Job acknowledged that those words were about him. Some people say, oh, that was a criticism of Elihu. Well, I don't think it was. And Job didn't think it was. Job accepted that he was the one that God was talking to in that verse. And then he says to Job, right, gird up now thy loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. Now, picture the scene. It's amazing, isn't it? The voice of God coming from this, a lightning-ridden sky with a huge whirlwind. And his man presented as man really is, as all of us are. That's all we are, what Job was like. Jesus declared the righteousness of God when he hung from that cross as a condemned criminal, which of course he wasn't, but he was according to Roman law. And that ultimately is all we are before God. Not that he wants to hammer us like a huge power. He loves us, as we have learnt from our studies. But nonetheless, that is the scenario. Now, Job in verse 3, gird up now thy loins like a man. I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. Who hath laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest? Or who hath stretched the line upon it? Now, the earth is a big place. I thought I'd put a few statistics up here because I like statistics. It has a circumference of 40,000 kilometres, that diameter. It weighs 6,000 million tonnes. It rotates at 1,650 kilometres per hour. It has an orbit speed of 100,000 kilometres per hour. The solar system is moving at 70,000 kilometres per hour through the Milky Way, and the Milky Way is moving at 2 million kilometres per hour. It's too much, isn't it? It puts us into our position. If we thought about that too much, we'd just curl up and and I don't know what we'd do. But it's just massive. I mean, man now, and look, we understand a lot more about science than what they did in the days of Job, but we still don't understand anything. We talk about how wise we are and how we can control the weather and all sorts of other things, but we can't. We haven't got a clue. We can't even really... I'm glad. I was going to ask Brother Jim about this because he's a scientist, but I think that science can't really even tell us what gravity is. Is that correct? It's correct. A lot of arguments. I can tell you that V equals U plus AT and D equals U T plus a half AT squared. I remember my Isaac Newton formulas from high school. But as to what it actually is, as God says, did you put the earth in its orbit around the sun and keep it there? It weighs 6,000 million tonnes, and it never varies. Year after year after year. Do you really know anything about that, Joe? No, clearly not. Clearly, we have no power over that. And then he moves to other things in the inanimate world, the non-living world. He says in verse 8, or can you control the sea when it breaks forth like I can? God has controlled the sea. It's in its place. Now and then it breaks forth in terrible tidal waves, and we see how much control we as mankind have over the sea. None at all. What about light and darkness? Come to verse 11, which is the end of the verse about the sea, And just make note. He says, hitherto shalt thou, that is the ocean, come, but no further. This is what I control, Job. And here shall the proud waves be stayed. Note that word proud. And then he talks about light in verse 12. Hast thou commanded the morning since thy days and caused the day spring to know his place, or the dawn, that it might take hold of the ends of the earth, that the wicked might be shaken out of it, the proud and the wicked. So he uses light as we understand light. Light, of course, is the great source of life on the earth, but spiritual light shakes out wickedness, and ultimately the earth will be filled with light and there'll be no places for the darkness of wickedness to reside. Do you really understand all about that, Job? And what about darkness? You've talked about death. You've said that you wish you could die. Well, in verse 17, have the gates of death been open unto thee? Or hast thou seen the doors of the shadow of death? Now, we don't want to talk about too much about this because people in this room at times have probably wished that they were dead, which is a very sad thing, and we need to obviously do all we can to help one another through the mental trials of our lives. But on that subject, God says, do you really understand about death, Job? Do you really understand the depth or the darkness of the gates of death? I looked it up. 2 people die every second. 60 million people die every year on the earth. And God's aware of every one of those because he created life. We don't have anywhere near the understanding of death, obviously, that God has. He understands what eternity is, and that death without hope cuts a person off from that eternity. And he's very saddened by that. And we don't really understand that, though we do understand perhaps from time to time that we would prefer death to life, which is very sad. And Job certainly knew that feeling. And God said, don't wish for death instead of life, Job. You don't understand what death is. Trust in me. He talks about the weather, and he said that he controls the weather. Now, of course, the weather is a very emotive subject at the moment, and mankind thinks he can control the weather, but he can't control the weather at all. God is in control of the weather. He says a very interesting thing in verse 26. He said that God causes it to rain on the earth where no man is, on the wilderness wherein there is no man, to satisfy the desolate and waste ground, and to cause the bud of the tender herb to spring forth. You see, Job, my care is painstaking. You think that I've taken my eye off the ball a bit and I don't really know what's going on with your suffering or with the wicked who are prospering. Job, right there, out there in the desert, where no man ever goes, where you and I never go, where still no man goes or woman goes. I care for things out there. I love things out there. And when the rain comes and the wildflowers spring forth and no one sees them, I love them. God loves beautiful flowers. The scope of my care, Job, is much greater than what you really understand. And I think Job is coming to understand that. And hopefully we are as well, as God goes through these scenarios that he's pointing out. And then he turns to the universe itself and says, I'm in charge of that too. The Milky Way is moving at 2 million kilometres per hour through the universe, and it's a small galaxy. It's just massive beyond our comprehension. And God says, I am controlling that. So what's he presenting to Job there? He's presenting creation, isn't he? The story of creation, which Job was extremely familiar with. That was his Bible. And he would have understood the spiritual aspect of the story of creation better than we would. And we know it well. We think about light and dark and all of those things. And God said, remember creation. Remember that I did it, and remember what it pointed forward to, and understand that I care about all these things. So he moved on from creation, which showed the magnitude of God's control, far beyond anything that we can imagine. And he moves to the animate world. the living world. And now, as well as God's power, he's going to see God's love. And God begins with a problem. In verse 39, will you hunt the prey for the lion or fill the appetite of the young lions? This is a problem. A ferocious lion kills an innocent gazelle or fawn or other animal, whatever the animal is. Would you arrange things like this, Job? No, you wouldn't. And in fact, history has proven how accurate the comments of Elihu were. Would you feed the lion? Well, man has nearly hunted them into extinction, and the tiger and other animals that are a danger to him wherever he can. So no, we wouldn't. We wouldn't have created it like Job, because we would have got rid of everything that was a danger to us. But that's not what God did. Would you hunt the prey for the lion or fill the appetite of the young lions when they couch in their dens and abide in the covert to lie in wait? Now Job is beginning to see that sometimes some things suffer not for the benefit necessarily of themselves, but for the benefit of others. And here is a primary example of that, the king of the beasts. And actually, it's a lioness. Remember, we're seeing Shaddai presented here, and that part of the Hebrew basis for that word referred to a mother, the mother of a young baby, and how that mother protects her young and can be violent if necessary. And the lion there is hunting food for its young baby. You wouldn't have arranged things like that, Job, but I have, because I care for everything. You see, the big question is, which one of those does God love more, the lion or the lamb? Well, he loves them both. That's the answer. You're suffering, Job. You don't know the reason for your suffering, but you're prepared to question me. Understand that I love all of my creatures and I provide for all of my creatures, and sometimes, often, in order to provide for some creatures, other creatures have to suffer. What a wonderful principle for Job to see. What a wonderful way to teach him as he listened to the voice of the Almighty and thought about that. Moreover, he completes the picture in the final verse with that rather ugly picture. In verse 41, who provides for the raven his food? Well, we've got the noble lion. Yes, he kills the lamb. That's very sad, but he takes the food back to his den and there's going to be more noble lions. And then once he's finished with it, along comes this filthy raven and starts pecking at the body of the lamb, or it's what's left of the body of the lamb. I provide for them too, Joe. I love them too. And you know what comes last? What was the last word that Job's friends said to him? Does anyone remember? Worm. You know what comes last in the food chain on that carcass, don't you? The worms, the maggots. I provide for them too. I provide for everything in my creation. And of course, human beings are the peak of that creation, and I provide for everyone. And sometimes, in order to provide, the innocent suffer for the guilty. That's what happens in nature, and that's what happens in human life as well. God moves on, and he's going to demonstrate to Job all of his universal care. So here's the poor goat or gazelle or whatever it is that's been hunted by the lion. But don't worry, I provide for them at the start of chapter 39. Knowest thou the time when the wild goats of the rock bring forth? Or canst thou mark when the hinds calve? No, I've provided for them too. So the wild goats up in the mountain, I've given them instincts so that when they're young, as soon as they're born, don't fall off the edge of a cliff, but know how to survive. And of course, there are the tame equivalents of the mountain goats. And they're young too, can survive as soon as they're born. I've provided for all of those, Job. I look after all of these things. And it's a lovely thing for us to think about, brethren and sisters, the extent of God's care. When we're in trouble and we're suffering, we can trust in a God that provides for so many things. so beautifully. And so he talks about the wild ass, which of course also has a domestic counterpart. He talks about the wild ox in verse 9, which has a domestic counterpart. All of these creatures, all so different, and yet I care for all of them, as I care for all human beings. He talks about the ostrich down in verse 13, the goodly wings of the peacocks. And in fact, that verse should say, the wings of the ostrich flap joyfully, but they cannot compare with the pinions and feathers of the stork. So there's two birds in that verse, the ostrich and the stork. Now, the stork is proverbially a wonderful mother. The stork delivers the baby wrapped in a napkin. That's how good a mother they are. The ostrich, on the other hand, has been considered to be a poor mother because apparently they lay their eggs in the dirt and leave them and run off. But ostriches survive and storks survive. And in verse 18, the ostrich has got one quality that the stork doesn't have. When she lifteth herself up on high, she scorneth the horse and his rider. She can run 60 kilometres an hour away from trouble. And perhaps that's how the ostrich does protect her young. She doesn't sit on the eggs, but she does run away, and those who are chasing her follow. And therefore the eggs are left safe in the dirt. Another animal runs toward trouble, the war horse, the powerful horse in verse 19. It's got instincts that are very different, the opposite to the ostrich, but I've provided for all of these, for the hawk and for the eagle. And we end up where we began, a bird of prey, a mother who dives from the sky on an unsuspecting victim and then takes the body back to the nest. And in verse 30, her young ones also suck up the blood, and where the slain are, so is she. So creation again, Job, and us. Think about what God has made, all of these different things, and he cares for them and he loves them all. He makes sure that they are fed, that they survive. He is not willing that any should perish. And you think about nature, and I don't know, I'm a city kid, so unfortunately I'm not one of these people in touch with nature all that well, but you think about it, everything that lives because something else suffers. The ultimate example of that is our Lord, and it seems like all of God's creation points to what he did. Now, he was a perfect offering, but he was an offering that was made that we might be saved. And of course, he was saved in that process. But everything else survives because something else dies. We're going to go and are we having a barbecue today? Sausages? Or there mightn't be any meat in those, but theoretically there is. So something died for that. And plants died so that we could eat our cereal this morning and all of that. That's a law of nature. And it doesn't show a God that doesn't care about things. It shows a God that cares intently about everything because everything survives. From the worm to the lion, they're all provided for. Marvellous what Job was being shown. And so what was his reaction to all of this? Well, in chapter 40 and verse 1, it says, moreover, Yahweh answered Job and says, shall he that contendeth with the Almighty instruct him? He that reproveth God, let him answer, says God. And Job says in verse 4, behold, I am vile. What shall I answer thee? I will lay my hand upon my mouth. Once have I spoken, but I will not answer, yea, twice, but I will proceed no further. Job had all but demanded his day in court. He pleaded for a day in court. And when it came along and God spoke first, he was very humbled by that because he was a faithful man. As all of us are humbled every week when we come around the table of the Lord and we think about what he did and then we examine ourselves. And that's what Job was doing. He was examining himself. And even though he'd suffered greatly, he had nothing to say in light of the power of God and the love of God. The power seen in the universe, but the love seen in his careful care over tiny little things They're far away from anything that man ever sees, and every creature in between. God cares over all of those things. And Job had nothing to say about that, but he still had something to learn. And God was going to teach him that, because down in verse 11 and 12, as we conclude our remarks this morning, God wasn't quite finished in answering Job. Verse 8, he restates what Job had all but done. Wilt thou condemn me that thou mayest be righteous? And I think Job's moving away from that point of view. He was happy to put his own righteousness on the table next to God's and compare them. God says, are you still happy to do that, Job? And in light of the wonders of creation, no, of course not. But there's one more thing that God wants to teach Job, and this is what he says in verse 11 and 12. Cast abroad the rage of thy wrath, and do this for me, Job. Behold every one that is proud and abase him. Look on every one that is proud and bring him low, and tread down the wicked in their place. So even if you could control all of the things that I control, all of those animals, all of those planets and galaxies, could you control pride and wickedness? Could you control human nature? And God is going to answer that, God willing, in our final study tomorrow.